Boo. Good morning, everybody. Hey, thanks for coming out to church today. It's great to have you. It really is. We just appreciate you being here. We hope that this is an enjoyable experience for you, but we hope even more than that, that you know that God cares about you. He knows where you're at right now and what's going on in your life, and He really, really loves you, and He wants to make a difference in your life. And that's true for all of us watching at home as well. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you as well. We are continuing our series called Wisdom, and what's interesting about this series, a little bit different than a lot of the other things we do, is this series is not about going to heaven. This particular series is not about living a righteous life. It's not really about pleasing God. It's really not about that. This whole series is about life, and it's about us having the best life that we can have. And not everything is necessarily that we're talking about here is necessarily sinful or not sort of pleasing God or not pleasing God. It's God's desire that our lives go well. And there are so many things in the Bible that tell us, how to do that, because God does care about, He really cares about us going to heaven and having a relationship with Him, putting our faith in Jesus. But He also cares about this life and about what we're going through. And so this series is all about that. And Proverbs kind of says it clearly many, many times, but it says this: if you are wise, your wisdom will reward you. If you are a mocker or a fool, you alone will suffer. This is true. This is true for our life. That if we are wise, our life will go better. It will serve us well in this life. If we are a mocker, if we are a fool, if we don't listen, we will suffer because of it. As a matter of fact, in my own life, what I have noticed is this, and I don't think I'm the only one, but in my life, what I've noticed is the most painful things that I've went through, and some of the most difficulties and some of the most heart-wrenching hurts that I have experienced in my life, I had everything to do with that. Most of the things in my life were because of doing unwise things, making poor choices, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Kind of my own behavior. It's my own foolishness that has brought the most hurt into my life. And generally speaking, I think that's true for all of us. Now, not everything that's hurtful in your life was necessarily because of you, but I think for all of us, if we're honest, take a step back and look at our lives and some of the difficulties and struggles, we can lead back to, you know what, I'm really the cause of that. I did that, I said that, and that's what hurt my life. And that's some of the struggles. That's what keeps me up at night, these kind of things in our life. In this whole series, we want to kind of overcome those things. But you know what's really interesting to me? For most of us, we have caused our own problems, but I wonder why. I have for myself. I thought, now why all these hurts in my life I caused, why did I do that? It wasn't because I woke up one day, and I don't think any of us do that, and say, you know what, I want to do something really stupid today. I want to really, you know what, I want to be so unwise. I want to do something that causes me pain. You know what, that's what I'm going to do. I think today is a good day to go and make a decision and tell somebody to do something that's really going to hurt my life. I just don't think many of us do that very often. So then why is it we do certain things? If it's not our intention, why do we do these things in our life? And, I think it just comes down to this, because it seems natural to us. It just seems like the thing to do. We're not on purpose making bad choices. I think it's just the natural outcome of how we respond to things makes sense to us. For example, for most of us, if you're raising kids, it's not always the wisest thing to do to give your kids everything they want, to let them do everything they want, and, eat ice cream till you puke. That's fine. I don't want to say no to you, I think sometimes we make these errors in our life because it just seems natural to us that we don't want to say no to our kids. It seems normal. It seems in our heart that I love my kids, and I don't want to say no to them. I don't want to discipline them. I want to give them everything. I want them to be happy all the time. And so I think that's kind of normal for us to do that. It's kind of what we naturally think, or we naturally do. And I think that's true with all of the things that we respond to in our life. I think sometimes that, when we do things that later on will hurt us, like when we're talking behind somebody's back in a negative way. Well, why would we do that? Because inside, at the time, we're frustrated, or we're angry at them, and somebody else is, and so we got a prime opportunity here to just cut them down. And here's the thing. It seems normal to us. It seems natural. It seems like the thing to do, and therefore we kind of respond on the things that we just automatically think. And I think this is just so clear in how the Bible can shine light onto this, and I hope that every one of us can gain some wisdom from this, because listen to how the Bible describes this dilemma or what we do. It says, there is a way that appears to be right. It seems right. It feels right. It appears to be the way to respond. But in the end, it leads to death. And I think so many times the reason we cause difficulty and trouble in our life is because it just seems right. It seems like the natural thing to do. It seems like a natural reaction. Like I said, none of us are trying to hurt ourselves or ruin our life or the people around us. What we do is it just seems right to us. And the next verse is just kind of like this. It says, a person's own folly. Okay, the things that we do, we make mistakes. It's like our own folly leads to their ruin, yet their heart rages against the Lord. Like, wow, is this so right on? It was just so amazing how this is so true, that so oftentimes these things that just appear to be right to us, these things that we just do, the folly, the mistakes that we make, and we want to blame others. We even sometimes we go beyond blaming others, even though, I remember one time, this is a true story, I couldn't believe it. I was visiting this guy in jail, and he is like his fourth or fifth time in jail, and he's done everything wrong. He's broken all the laws, especially a lot of drug stuff, And so I'm visiting him in jail, and for 10 minutes I had to listen to him blame the cops for catching him. I'm serious. Blamed the cops for catching him. It's a dang cop's fault. If it wasn't for those cops, I wouldn't be here. Well, I get that's kind of true, but I got to stop saying stupid so much. That's dumb. Is that okay? That's totally dumb. But here's the thing, for all of us, we have this tendency that our own decisions bring folly into our life, and we want to blame other people. And sometimes we even want to blame God. We want to blame God for the things we've done, for the mistakes. Like, you know what? I disregarded everything God said. I've done what I want to do, and my life isn't going well, and so I'm going to blame God for that. And you know what? Sometimes we do that. Even good people, we tend to want to do that. So, like, what's the answer? What are we going to do? We keep making these mistakes. We keep doing what seems right to us, and it brings trouble in our life. How do we fix it? How can you and I say, I want to avoid doing some foolish things so my life goes better? Well, I think it's just kind of obvious what we have to do is we have to stop trusting what we think is so natural. We got to stop just reacting like we normally think this is the way to do it. And we have got to confer, we've got to check, we've got to follow, we've got to listen to somebody that is smarter than us. Now, sometimes we're just not the smartest. We have got to gain wisdom from somebody who is wiser than us. And not trust ourselves all the time, not just react. How about like asking somebody else? And I think of like, who's the wisest person I know? I know my dad is really, really wise. He's proven to be wise throughout his life, and he's given me great advice. My in-laws are wise. Some of you are wise. Shaheen's not very wise, but... oh, he's getting a little wiser. Did you see the gray that's starting? Next week, I want you guys to notice online the gray hair that he has. Okay. Who is the wisest of them all? Listen to this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Who's wiser than God? Whether you are a follower of God, whether you're completely a believer in God, or how close you are in your relationship with God, probably doesn't matter. Because I think every one of us can really, if we're honest with ourselves and we're just looking at this logically, God has got to be wiser than us. God knows everything. God created everything. God created mankind. He created how we think, how we feel. God created all the things that we know and all the things, and God holds everything together. God holds the future. God knows tomorrow, and you and I don't. Wouldn't it just make sense to follow him? Because really it comes down to this. God is wiser than me. He is. I may not always like what he says. I may not agree with what he says, which would just prove that he's wiser than me. If I don't agree with what God says, it would behoove me, I like that word, it would be to my advantage to trust what he says instead of me if we disagree. Hey, that rhymed. Wouldn't that make sense? To trust God, because the point is, and we can all admit it, God is wiser than we are. God knows the future. Nobody else does. And nobody knows what's going to happen next month. God does. No one knows about relationships and the response and how things happen like God does. God knows how we're wired. There is no one wiser than God. He is definitely wiser than me. And once we get to that conclusion, and we have to get there, whether we like it or whether we don't, each one of us have got to answer that question. Is God wiser than you? If you say you don't think so, I don't know what else to say. I'm out of words. But if you would agree with me that, yeah, God's probably wiser than me, then we can move on. Because if God is wiser than me, shouldn't we confer with him? Shouldn't we listen to what he says? Shouldn't we do what he says in our life to make good decisions for our life? Jesus, told a story that it's so practical and it makes so much sense that I hope that this story sinks into each one of our lives, to each one of us, and we would acknowledge, whether we like it or whether we don't, that we would acknowledge that God is wiser than me. Listen to his story that he tells. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, these would be God's words, either Jesus spoke them, the apostles wrote them, whatever. He says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Anyone who hears what God says and puts them into practice is wise. They are wise like a person building a house on a rock foundation. He says, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall. Why? Because it had its foundation on the rock. This is an analogy to our lives. This is what Jesus is telling a story about our lives, about how things go. And he said, if anyone hears the words of God, the directions, the wisdom of God, and applies it to their life will be solid and firm. Troubles of life will come. Life has always got its issues and its stuff. But your life will stand firm, be strong, be stable. You will not be destroyed by the things of the world. You will get through if you do the things that God says. Now he goes on and he says this. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice, I don't agree with that. I don't want to. That's old-fashioned. You know what? I just don't think that's going to fit. Anyone who hears what God says, who knows that this is what God says for life, but says, you know what? I think I'm wiser than God. No, I think that doesn't apply to me. Anyone who does that, he says this analogy, and this is for all, we can't escape this. This is for all of our lives. He says that we are like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, just like the other one. But listen to this. And it fell with a great crash. When lives fall apart because of foolishness, it's painful. It falls with a great crash. And you and I all have been in circumstances and situations, and we've seen others who live their life foolishly, and their life comes crumbling in, and everything goes wrong. Nothing's ever good. And it's a great crash. It's a destruction of a life. And you and I, we have choices to make every day in everything that we do. And the question is, are we going to live our lives wise and benefit from it? Or are we going to live our lives foolish and be brought to ruin? It's our choice. How do we do that? By actually following what he said. Listen to this. It says, the wise thing for me is to do what God says. That's personal for me. I know this. The wise thing for me, in every situation, everything I run into, the wise thing for me is to do what God says. Do you know why? Because God's wiser than me. Because God knows what he's talking about. But here's the struggle, is sometimes we just don't like what God says. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense to us, and so we pick and choose, and we all do this, and we just say, no, I know what God says, but I don't care in a sense. I don't care. I'm going to do my own thing. And to think about every area of life. And there's some huge things in life that aren't necessarily a command. They're not, like a sin or not a sin. Just that the Bible, the New Testament and Proverbs in the Bible, is just God's wisdom for how to live our lives. There's one place where it says in the Bible that to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, is it a sin if you don't? Do you have to do that? No. Well, then why does God say that? Because it's the wisest thing for our life. Be quick to listen. Whatever circumstance you're in, be slow to speak and slow to become angry. Think about your life and how many situations you could have avoided. How much pain, arguing, struggle, hurt, sleepless nights if we'd have just followed the wisdom of God. To be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I was with a gentleman last week. He was going to court for custody of his kids, and his ex-wife put a restraining order on him to not see his kids. Well, the restraining order, when you do that, the restraining order is in effect until you see a judge, for the judge to actually look at this and say, well, is there reason for this, or were you just mad at your husband and didn't want to, whatever. So he asked me to go to court with him, and I did. And as we were going through and stuff, it was done, and the judge said, you know what, there's no grounds for this. There was no, physical things. So the judge said, I can't grant this. I can't grant this. So the gentleman, you can go ahead and see your kids. There's no reason for this. And so right after, I said, hey, congratulations, but make sure you're, really live your life good and all that stuff. I saw him the next day, and I said, so did you contact your ex-wife, and did you, pick up the kids, or did you see the kids? And here's what he said to me. He said, no, I didn't even call her. And like most of us would think, well, why? You had the right to. The judge even ruled in your favor. Why didn't you just go get your kids? And he said, this is the wisest thing. I was just thrilled to see this wisdom in this man. He said, yeah, I know the judge gave me the thing, and I know I could go see my kids, but I think it's better just to let things cool down before I call her. You guys, that's an example of being quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to move. Even though I have every right to do it, it wouldn't be the wise thing. The wise thing is to give her time. The wise thing is to, do you understand what I'm saying? It's like what God's talking about is so true in our life. Can I do it? Do I ever? Sure, but it's not the wise thing to do in the long haul. I think there's so many things in our life like that. I think sometimes that just doing what God says. Now, so many of us, and I'm just going to pick on a few. I'm just going to hit a few because they're major parts of our life. But God gives us really good instructions about our finances. Really good instructions. What God says, generally speaking, is two major things. Two major things. One, make sure you're generous. And number two, save some money. Don't spend all your money. Don't go into debt. I mean, that's kind of like God's principles. This is what God says for us to do. Do we have to go to heaven? No. Do we have to? Is it a sin if we don't? No. This is God loving us so much. Said, listen, here's wisdom for your life so it goes well. We don't have to do it. But think about your own self. Think where you would be today if you would do what God says. Why? Because the wise thing to do is what God says to do. That's the wisest thing for me to do, is what God says. Yeah, but I don't have enough. Yeah, and we have all these excuses. But God is wiser than we are, and the wise thing to do is do what He says, because in the long run, in the end, our lives will go better if we are generous with our finances and we save, we don't go into debt, and we live within our means. Think about how that would change people's lives. It's the wise thing to do. You don't have to be a Christian to follow the wisdom of God, and it works for everybody because it's simply the wise thing to do. Another thing, just kind of part of our life, God says that you and I should not talk behind people's backs. He says, as a matter of fact, it's a horrible thing to do, to cut people down, to talk behind people's backs. And you know what? Do we have to do that to go to? No. Do we? You guys, it's just God's wisdom. You can talk behind people's backs if you want to, but you will suffer because of being foolish. How many times do I wish I would have never talked behind somebody's back? It has come back and it has hurt relationships. It has caused more pain in my life from doing that. It is a foolish thing to do. What does God say to do? Don't do it. Don't care how we feel. Remember, what's natural for us, what we want to do, is not wise. We don't listen and we don't do what we want to do. We do what God says we want to do. I want to just mention two more. Sometimes we think that, well, God is old-fashioned. I don't know how many times I've heard, hey, it's 2019. Get up with the times. About our sexuality and immorality. Now, God says that He wants us to save intimacy for marriage. That's what God says. Why does God say that? Because God's wiser than us. He is. And I don't know how many of us in this room can say, never understood it at the time. Didn't seem like it really mattered. But boy, did I suffer because of it. I think because of that, it's caused us more pain as a culture, caused more pain in our lives than what we ever give it credit for. I think so oftentimes it doesn't show until later that we struggle with intimacy, or our first two marriages don't work, or we have a lower self-esteem, or it really has. I think God, listen, it comes to this, the wise thing for me is to do what God says. I may not always understand it. I may not even like it. But it's the wise thing to do in our lives. And I just want to, and I know none of us are perfect, but I just really want to ask you to think about something. As I am myself. What am I doing in my life right now that is just the opposite of what God says to do? Whether it's loving people, whether it's forgiving people, whether it's talking behind people's back, whether it's being generous, whatever it is that God is asking us to do, why am I not doing it? Why? I'm aware that I'm not, but why? And are we aware that it will bring us harm? It won't affect our eternity, it won't affect heaven, and maybe you don't care. But here's the truth, that it will bring us harm. We will suffer by doing our own thing versus what God says to do. The wise thing to do in our life, for our lives to be the best, is to do what God says. What area of your life are you not doing what God says and you are fully aware He says to? Because I want to pray for us to have the strength, have the wisdom, and the maturity to do what God says. Whether we agree, whether we don't, and we'll do that. So let's pray today. Father, I want to take a moment to pray for each one of us, because I know that this is a real thing. I know we all struggle with it. God says to do this, but we don't. God may say, God says follow the rules of the land, and yet we don't. God says to do all kinds of things, and we're aware. I mean, not that we're perfect, but in so many things we don't even try. We just give it up. We just say, I don't care. Father, my fear is that someday when the pain comes, we will shake our fist at you, or we will blame others. Father, help us not do that. Help us to become wise, to live our lives the best that we can, to have the best outcome, to have a blessed life by doing what you say to do. And Lord, I just pray that some of us today would make that decision to start doing what you said. We may not get it or understand it completely, but we know this. We know that you are wiser than me. And the wisest thing for me to do is to do what you say. Give me the strength to do that, to change my life, and my life would be more blessed. In Jesus' name, amen.